Good evening. Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah, friends. My name is Amichai Lau-Lavie. I'm at home in Harlem with my books, and it is a pleasure tonight to be in conversation with Nicole Krauss and Rabbi Namdar, two friends, noted authors, thoughtful leaders in the Jewish community who are thinking about what does it mean to be present in place in this moment when we are all both displaced and socially separate from each other and yet connected in ways we never knew we could. This conversation is happening as part of the Z3 conference, and it's happening on Hanukkah, the holiday in which we get to light candles in our windowsills so we are more connected, both to our past and to each other. So we want to talk tonight as three, not young, not old, Jews living in the United States. We're all in New York at the moment. We're all parents. We're all involved in Jewish culture and Jewish spirituality. We have a deep connection with Israel and with our past and present. And we are curious about what all these convergences have to say to us, to each other at this moment, Hanukkah 2020, which is a challenge that one would say none of us have had before. I want to throw a metaphor into the mix here and use that maybe as a way for us to think about this question that we framed for this night that has to do with the third space and maybe with the third rail of this Israel diaspora center periphery narrative. I'm talking about a little toy that I wish I had with me right now, but I just can't find it. It's called a svivon in Hebrew, a dreidel in Yiddish, a spinning top in American lore, and it's that little game we play on Hanukkah that's got four sides that was originally a German gambling game and was eventually converted to Judaism by having those four letters, nicht, ganz, half showing, again, never, half, all, into Hebrew. Nes gadol hayasham. A great miracle happened there. And many, many generations have grown up playing dreidel next to the candlelight of Hanukkah, talking about the miracle that happened there, in the land of Israel, with the Maccabees, with military might, whether it happened or not. In the 20th century, something interesting happened. That game made it to Israel, the beginning of the Zionist enterprise. And somebody had the idea of not using the letter shin, talking about a miracle over there, but replacing it with the letter pei, here. So Nes Gadol Haya Po is how I grew up in Israel. The miracle was here, and now Israel is back. But all these years later, I got three American kids growing up here. They only know the one that has shin, even though I've bought them the one that says po. And over the years, I've been thinking about how weird it is that this little toy is the emblem of the difference between Israel and the diaspora. They're all made in China, but one of them says here and the other says there, and we all play the same game, but we're not. So in 2020, we're all on Zoom. The question of here and there seems almost ludicrous. And more importantly, the connection between Israel and the rest of the world is questioned. Is there a here, there anymore? Is there a there anymore? Because of Zoom, because of the global connection, because of all the ways we are transcending and dancing these different dances of identity. What does it mean to be invested in Israel as the center while so many of us are not there? And at the same time, so connected to what Israel has to say to us today. Nicole and Ruby have deep connections to Israel, having grown up there or spent a significant amount of time there, writing about Israel enormously deeply in their writings. I myself was born in Israel, raised there, and have been in the States for 20 years, where I now work as a rabbi, interested in the conversation as it is evolving between Jewish culture, identity, spirituality, and our connection to where we come from, who we are, and where we're going. So on this night of Hanukkah, the miracle that the three of us are all meeting in one library across Zoom screens. And I want to invite Nicole and then Ruby to really think aloud with me about this question of, is there? And what does this Zoom ritual moment do to alter or redefine our sense of shared space in 2020? So thank you for joining us. It's an honor to be in the room with you all. And I'm going to hand it over to either one of you. Where is this question meeting you today?
Ruby, do you want to
Nicole,
start?
I think you should.
Okay. Um, Thank you, Amichai. That was beautiful and raises so many thoughts. I think the first thought it raises for me most significantly and immediately as a writer is the old thought that many have voiced in different ways. I think Saul Bellow once put it as a writer has no homeland except his or her language. And next to that thought is the notion that within the realm of literature, and this has been the case within the realm of text for the Jewish people for 2,000 years, but within the realm of literature, we have always shared in a conjoined space. I always have thought of literature, all art, but specifically literature, as a kind of parallel world that exists alongside the one that we inhabit, but one which has different rules of reality. Maybe most significantly, that meaning is possible, coherence is
Mhm.
possible, as it isn't in our daily lives and in our mundane, hurried reality, unstudied realities in which we're only ever responsive to whatever the next catastrophe or banality is. But in over there in that parallel other world of literature, which we step into as young readers, and many of us inhabit all our lives, and then if we become writers, we begin to move furniture around and build worlds in that parallel reality that other readers join us in. Over there, in that elsewhere, there's this, there's consolation, there is unions, there is meaning, and we have this opportunity. Although those two worlds will forever remain distinct, they will never cross over. The laws of this reality will never, the laws of really apply to this reality. The characters who live there could never survive here, and vice versa. But we have this kind of door between them that, as readers and as Jews with our texts, we constantly can smuggle back meaning, consolation,
Yeah.
coherence, revelation, and apply it as we might to our lives. And so, for as long as I can remember, my experience as a person in the world, a daughter, a Jew, part of a family, has paralleled my experience as a reader writer, because as a Jew in the world, I was born into a family without one place that had a home. I am the daughter of four grandparents who are Jewish and had to leave Europe because of the Holocaust. My mom grew up in London. My father was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Tel Aviv, came back to New York. And so the only unifying geography of my family's life, the place where people went to marry, people went to make aliyah and live out the rest of their lives, people went to have babies, was Israel. And yet our lives very often took place practically in New York. So this feeling of here and there, here and elsewhere, of living two lives, as I said, became kind of paralleled or quoted or reflected back in my own personal life, which has become my professional life, the life of literature, the life of being inside of books, of writing books. And I'm going to stop talking here because I want to open this, Ruby. There's so many things I want to say about this in terms of my own experience with this here and there. Um, but I think it's one that he can relate to very strongly because he's had similar experiences and in many ways has chosen, as I have chosen, or refused to choose between these two places. He insists on
Yes.
living in both. Maybe that's the third space that we're going to meet, both the Zoom space, the space of literature, and the space that is neither Israel nor America, but someplace in between.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. As you were speaking, I just realized how amazing it is because seemingly there's nothing similar about our family's experiences, but everything you said about your family could have been said about mine. I mean, I have grandparents who left one city in Iran to move to the capital, and then my parents, both in under very different circumstances and time periods, decided to leave Iran, where they've been living for many, many centuries, their families, and go to Israel. And here I am living in New York, raising kids who are, bilingual, and sitting here with you guys and talking about that third space. And I think that always felt that your quotation of Bello was so true for me, because I always felt that Hebrew was my true homeland. And as you were speaking, I realized that also for the Jews in particular, language and literature were our true homelands. Because if we were historically looking at ourselves historically, homeland was always fiction for the Jews, always. And the minute, much like our families, the minute somebody got to the place, immediately could be 200 years later or 300 years later, there was a move. And everything switched. And the whole question of center and periphery was always a very open question, although nobody could really tell what center is. And I reject this to the day. If Israel is a center, I don't see things this way, because I think we were always on the move. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite facts about the Hebrew language and the Hebrew culture is that the word ivri means passerby, somebody who's in transition. Avraham Ivri, Abraham the Hebrew, means Abraham the man in transition, the nomad, he who passed. So our very essence, I think, of our holy language, our literature, our peoplehood, our being, is the essence of transition. So as a matter of fact, I feel that this discomfort of identity is actually, personally, my happy place, my comfortable place. I had arguments with Israeli intellectuals and authors who were claiming, that the Jewish problem, again, a famous anti-Semitic trope, the Jewish problem was solved with Zionism, because finally there's a place where you could pin the place, identity, and language, and for the religious Zionist religion, take all of them, pin them on one spot of land, and solve this weird anomaly that we call Jewish, in which I am in love, and without which I am not going to live, this wonderful anomaly. Literature, exactly as you said, Nicole, is it's not an idealized reality. It's a reality that lives outside of our reality, but this is really our promised land, a place to which we yearn. And exactly, it's as if we're going on a pilgrimage to the place of literature. We do it, you and I, do it through modern fiction. Our ancestors did it through their forms of literature. But from the inception of our culture, literature was at the base of our identity, be it the Torah, then the Talmud, then all Kabbalistic and mystical writings, and Midrash, and then modern Jewish writings. They were all forms of literature, and if you will, forms of fiction. And I very much connect to what you're saying, Nicole, that our fiction is our tool of trying to create meaning and distilling meaning out of this chaotic world. And speaking of literature, I know, and always have been very curious about this duality in your writing, and I would like to ask you, if that's okay, about your writing, because I know that there's always a very important component of transition and living and being betwixt and between the two places, Israel and America, in your writing. And I know that it was very strong in the first books. It was really big in Forest Dark. Forest Dark really opened this. And I know that in your new book, Being a Man, which is a collection of short stories, if I'm not mistaken, half of the stories, am I right, take place in Israel. And this is fascinating to me. And I would like you to please tell us about it. First, about the book a little, and B, about the place of Israel in your writing.
Absolutely. Well, so the collection of stories "To Be a Man," which just came out a couple of weeks ago on Election Day of all days, I would say 6 out of the 10 stories. It's not that so much that they're set in Israel; is that they yoke together America and Israel. They don't choose one or the other; they move between those spaces. And I would say that this fascination for me with thresholds, what it is to stand on the threshold and the threshold between spaces, is a line that's woven throughout my work through many, many different themes, not only themes of place, of Israel or here, of being in 2 places at the same time, but also of relationships. Do we stay? Do we go? Do we need fresh life and experience, or do we need security and comfort of stability? Or so I'm so interested in the place where you can put a character on a fault line, whether it's a fault line in his soul or in his being, or whether it's a fault line between the choice of where he will go forward or where he will fall back on. So one of those, of course, you put your finger on one of the largest of those fault lines, and that is between this place and that place, and or no place, which is the third place, or the every place. But what I would say is that for me, in Forest Stark, the novel has two parallel stories, right? So even there, I don't choose between one narrative. I need both.
True.
And both of those narratives go from New York and to Tel Aviv and out into the Israeli desert. In the beginning of the second narrative is a moment in which the character, who's also called Nicole, because it's not enough to have one of us, we need to have multitudes of ourselves. Another reason we write and inhabit many places. She walks into her home and she has this distinct feeling that she is already in the house, someplace else upstairs. And this opens the idea in the novel of being 2 places at once. And she recalls her earliest memories as a child, which I tell you is my earliest memory. Here I confess to you that this is my earliest memory, which is of being 2 years old and absolutely believing that I was seeing myself on television in the studio audience of whatever it was, Romper Room, where they used to have kids in the TV show watching. And I absolutely knew at 2 years old, had sneakers and the look in my eyes of what it was to be me. But I had never been in a studio audience, and I had never been in a television production house or wherever this was taking place. And yet that is the foundation on which all of the stratifications of my memory since are built. What does it mean to have as your earliest memory this dichotomy of being here and there, a refusal to choose, a kind of split in the soul of occupying 2 places? There are a million ways to analyze it, and I won't get on the psychoanalytic couch here, but I will say that I think for me this has very much to do with the place, both the feeling of being born at a moment in time in which the old world, the world of my grandparents, literally could no longer be accessed. It ceased to exist. This other place over there could no longer be returned to. And yet there was something of us, of them, that continued to occupy it. Then again, this growing up in New York and never being taught ever to commit to a nationality, to commit to a place. We were always moving. Our allegiances were always elsewhere, right? And I think so for me, that this desire in my work to somehow have both of these things, I feel like you. And I want to pose you a difficult question when I get to the end of my answer about this, because I'm not sure that we're not asking to have our cake and eat it too. Because I think for me, in my work, I want to have both American ideals, the ideals that fascinated our friend Bello, who we already mentioned, which is what it is to be this American idea of wholesale self-invention. You can be whatever you want. Invent yourself. The sky is the limit. No class system, nothing to hold you back except your imagination or your lack of abilities. And this is such an American idea, which I think a lot of the world with much older histories on its shoulders would scoff at, does scoff at. It's an idea of self-invention, and I want to have the energy of that in my work. At the same time, I don't want to give up what it is to have the energy of the absurd life, everyday life in Israel, or 3,000 years of history pressing down on a people who are trying to. and all of the fabric of society, of friendship, of family, all of that nitty gritty that is a writer's dream. I don't want to give that up either, right? And so there's a way in which I want to have, literally, I want to belong to both worlds of material as a writer, and have them all. And I guess the question I want to ask you, because I think you feel similarly, you're a writer born in Israel, born into Hebrew, who wrote his first novel about an American, which is, you embodied an American,
Yes.
right? And so I guess one of my questions for you is, we talk about the idea that Israel, that the Jews have always lived with this place as an idea. But the truth is that although Israel has swung from reality to idea and reality to idea and back again, since God said to Abraham, "Go over there, lech lecha," like, this is my idea for you. It's swung back and
Yeah.
forth, and all the expulsions, and back and forth through time. But the truth is now it's not. It's no longer an idea. It is a reality. It's been a hard, true, undeniable reality for 70 years. You were born into it. You grew up in it. How is it fair? Is it fair to continue for us as writers, even as we study the place and are scholars of it, or come of its fabric as you have, is it fair to think of it as still an idea, since it is so, to everyone who remains there, it is an every.
Okay, as usual, this is a brilliant question. Thank you, Nicole. First of all, I really love that what you said about eating the cake and having it too. I think you just summarized the great ambition that is art. Because in reality, you cannot eat the cake and have it too. But in art, you actually must strive to do that. Because otherwise, just to write two-dimensional, realistic reality, we don't need to destroy the forests, the dark forests, and make paper, and then destroy other dark forests and make ink. I mean, there's reality. We are looking for the reality that's above or under or behind the screen of reality as we know it. And in those realities, the real realities, if you will, you can absolutely and you should try to rise above this dichotomy of eating the cake and having it too. And your question is very poignant because yes, there is a privilege of growing up in Israel and pretending that the equation was solved. There's a form of a privilege, or in my opinion, a fake privilege. And I never felt that. It wasn't enough for me. The simplification, like taking a multi-dimensional identity and flattening it into a 2D picture, and like it's like taking a beautiful butterfly and pinning it to an album. That's not, I don't want that. I never felt comfortable within that simple identity that pinned me to the place and solved the dilemma. As a child, maybe because I'm the firstborn son of immigrants, could be, but I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's a Kabbalistic soul thing. I don't know. I never felt comfortable or satisfied with the simple identity solutions. Even my Hebrew, as you said, it's never been the Israeli Hebrew of the everyday that so many of our colleagues in Israel write in right now. It just doesn't, I'm not drawn to it. So in many ways, you could say that I was already a writer in exile, even while I lived in Jerusalem. And Amichai knew me at the time. And we were both already, right, Amichai, in form of like intellectuals in exile, even when we lived in Jerusalem, because we were always in the place and outside of the place. And we drank quite a bit of brandy discussing this duality. So we know it's there. For me, coming to New York and experiencing New York through the Hebrew lens was my life and mind altering, because when you come to this great city, which is, New York is fascinating because it's relatively a new city, but it carries itself like an ancient city with all a million layers of mythology, 200 years more or less, and it's like already behaving like it's Rome or Jerusalem. It has an old soul, New York, even though if it's a new city. So for me, it was only an invitation to read it in biblical terms that living in Hebrew can provide. So it was actually a very exciting project to undo this whole hermetic illusion that yes, Hebrew lives in Israel, and you should use it to talk about soldiers and second generation Holocaust and like the 3-4 other topics that all Israeli writers write about. And I was like, no, it's actually much more exciting. And yes, I want the cake and I want to eat it. I want to be very Hebrew, and I do not want to be trapped in that thematic and stylistic cage. And for me, this was a very Jewish moment, that undoing the gravity center of Israel as the only place where Hebrew lives. And I'm very curious, Nicole, to know if you were writing in, I mean, I know it's a weird question, but do you think the fact that you write in English about Israel, does it recreate Israel in a way that might be different than the way I would write? Does the language hold in itself a set of interpretations or projections
I'm
about the
sure.
place?
I'm sure that it does. I'm absolutely sure it does. And I will also add to that that I feel I've only written a few. I've only written a few Israeli characters in which I've actually embodied them, right? I've written them from the outside, from a kind of third person perspective, but I can think of immediately one, Aaron, who is the quite tough Israeli father in Great House, who's estranged from his now grown up son. And I remember being nervous about sharing that. I gave that first to David Grossman and then to Amos Oz. I gave it to both of them to read in manuscript as a check to see whether it was okay.
Not a bad focus
I
group.
won't tell you their reactions, but I each had a slightly different reaction. But there were 4 voices in that novel, and one was English, and 2 were American, and 1 was this Israeli voice. And I've only done that in the collection of short stories. To Be a Man, there's another narrator who's lived in New York for 20 years, but she's Israeli, and but I feel a little bit. I love that you wrote an entire novel in American clothes, and an American character in American clothes, who an American character whose New York life gets invaded, interrupted, disturbed by these ancient visions, right? So the way you came at it was fascinating to me, because you brought your how can I put it, like your nativeness, you pushed it into the character in this completely unexpected way, right? And so I think it's interesting. I don't know, in terms of English versus Hebrew, it's hard for me to say. I think that mostly what I focus on is how much I miss when that I can't read your work, for example, in Hebrew. I can't read many of the writers that I love in Hebrew. What am I missing there? But I'm extremely grateful to be born into English, because it's such a hugely muscular, varied language, right? It's a huge gift. I've always felt. And to apply it to Israel, I never felt lacking there, but I'm sure it's colored by the polish of my foreignness. No matter how many of us keep going there, I will always be from the diaspora, looking there, looking at that place. Amichai, can we ask you whether you are constantly moving back and forth literally between these worlds, and also bringing together audiences from both of these worlds? How do you think about some of these things that we've been talking about, this notion of like a third space that one can possibly create? Can one do that in community? Can one do you feel like you do that when you're in
I
your
have to
own
say,
work in
listening
different
to you
ways?
both, first of all, this is such a treat and a privilege. I'm like a book on your bookshelf, like listening on our conjoined screen bookshelf. My journey has led me not only from Israel to the United States some 20 years ago, but also into the work of translation. The main work that I do is translating Torah from Hebrew and ancient into English and contemporary, and also dancing back and forth between what does it mean to transcend the classical definition of Hebrew and Hebraic and Judaic and tribal and specific towards a universal experience where the essence of the story is what matters. So I'm a translator, and my work with storytelling and now with Lab Shul is all about how do we take this Bronze Age book and make it relevant, and when do we fight with it? And I'm hearing you both, and I'm thinking that I'm curious about us being in a paradigm shift right now. And Nicole, I think you said it so powerfully, and also in some of your writing about being a diaspora Jew in and out of Israel, that we're moving from an either or, from a this place or that place, Israel the center, diaspora the weak support system, even though the financial backbone, into a both and. We're no longer in an either or. Fluidity is in some way the marker of postmodernism, whether it's gender or whether it's identity. These days of COVID are making us make very clear decisions about pod and local and what's mine and what's not. And if I'm going to travel somewhere, where am I welcome and where am I a foreigner? It brings up a lot of those walls, and we're also walking out of 4 years of a presidential America where the other is so much present in a way that we're trying to transcend. But I'm connected to the Hebraic notion, as Ruby said, and as we mentioned, of Lech Lecha, that the going back and forth, Ratzov Shov, here and there, between identities and between polarities is, for me, the essence of Hebrew and Jewish and human. And my work of translation is saying we're constantly going back and forth. There's always pros and cons. Maybe it is having the cake and eating it. And what I think there's a paradigm shift is because the Israeli identity and the Jewish identity I grew up with is that there's one way and that's the right way. That there's hierarchy and there's authority. Orthodox, which is how I grew up, said there's one way, and if you go left or right, you're off the way. You're off the highway. Don't go down that exit. Israel, my father was a Holocaust survivor. My mother was raised in England, made Aliyah. Israel was what it's all about. And the rest was just a story that's going to wither until everybody makes Aliyah. And then to everybody's surprise, I came here for what was a theater project that years later is right now who and what I am. And when Ruby and I worked together back in the 90s, we were actually Zionist educators. Our job was to induct American youth who were there for the summer, basically to get laid, to basically get excited about Israel and Judaism. That was our job. We were Zionist Jewish educators. And all these years later, as parents of kids who are growing up here and as cultural creators in different ways, I'm wondering whether the three of us in this august conversation, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift. It's not about either or. It's not even about Israeli American. It's about the both and in a way that we don't quite know how to handle yet. And Judaism doesn't know how to handle yet. Israel doesn't know how to handle yet, which is maybe why we're having this conference. This Z3 thing's like, well, what is Zionist in 2020? What is Jewish when we know that it's both and? And this new non-duality on the one hand is very new, and at the same time, I believe it's the very essence of who we are, which is radical. Right? For Avraham to be Lech Lecha, it means you're constantly leaving your father's house to the land that you will go to, but then he leaves again. So there's this constant. So I'm just hearing you, and I'm wondering whether we're in a paradigm shift because in 21st century that's what's going on. I love Israel. I loved it for my family. It is home. for all the reasons that we love. I do want to go back there one day. I hope the political reality will allow me to do that, but I don't want to give up my sense of being here in the world. So there's a paradigm shift because of that. And I think Corona, that we're in the middle of, because of the Zoom reality, and it's maybe soon to tell, and I don't want to give it too much mythic meaning. I said about the dreidel is redefining our sense of self and place in ways that I think are radical. And we don't know where it's going yet. Because forget being in Tel Aviv or in Palo Alto or in New York. We're here now. And this is Makom. This is a place right now. How will that alter our sense of being Zionists, Israelis, Americans, dwellers, nomads? If fiction gives us the place to be, right? What does this give us?
Well, one of the things that all of those points raised for me is, and this is related to the having cake and eating it too, and related to perhaps the possibility that we're all converging now in a unified space. But I want to then ask, but what about the fact that part of the pleasure of our positions historically, the three of our positions and many other people's positions who live in both places, and maybe ultimately the Jewish position for the last 2,000 some years, is non-committal. There's something non-committal there, and that non-committal of our living and our hearts and our being is a necessary discomfort, to be comfortable with that discomfort. It's it's a schooling in uncertainty. No textual education could educate you more deeply than the Jewish textual education in doubt and in the sustaining of ambiguity and uncertainty. The cake doesn't always taste so good. That's my point. The cake is sometimes hard to digest, right? It's not like always so good. But this non-committal posture is really significant. It's part of who we all are, and that is part of why I see like literature generally and Jewish thinking so aligned, because also the history of the novel is a history of ambiguity. Like the novel is about ambiguity. It's to occupy that position. But that aside, what does it mean then if what you're suggesting, and I find it very hard to imagine a commitment to a third virtual space, because I find virtual space very thin. I mean, it has its pleasures and its aspects, but it's still very thin. But how would a unified existence, what would we do with all of our adherence to our love of our non-committal position?
It's interesting, Nicole, that you choose non-committal as the term that organizes your argument here, because I feel that Jewish culture and our work is very hyper-committal. It's not non-committal. I don't experience it as this. I feel that we're very committed, and as a matter of fact, we're so committed to the various truths that we are not willing to simplify the equation of existence into
Wait, can I
one
interrupt
simple
you?
solution.
I
Please.
have to interrupt you there. Are you committed to the truths, or are you committed to the question? Because you're committed to the question,
Well,
you're committed to something that I think of. Maybe I'm using the wrong term, but you're committed to. I think when I read your work, I think of you, and when I first met you, and I sat in on your classes, of thinking about Jewish texts. The goal was never to solve the argument. It's to keep the argument alive and aloft.
yes,
And
absolutely.
that is what I mean. So maybe I should say commitment
Thank
to
you
the
very much for this. Thank you very much for this clarification. When I say truths, I didn't mean answers. That's a great clarification. Truth, like I mean that if you and I and Amichai and every other thinking person that I know would really not feel that there's a complex reality, I don't think we would just inflate reality into complexity just because we're bored or we want to write books and make a name for ourselves. I feel that this really stems from a complex experience of reality. And for you and me and Amichai, I feel the idea of a promised land is not an empty phrase. The whole notion of there's a reality, there's another place which is by definition a place of fantasy, projection, ideals, but it is as real for me than my life here now. I can take my dog Zipper now and go out to Riverside Park for a little walk after this interview, after this conversation, and I'll be very much here. But at the same time, there are other places where are very real to me. And again, I think that it is not accidental that you and I are writing about. We're not limited. I don't think it's a commitment issue. I think that you feel that reality. I feel at least the reality of our identity is just larger than this place or that place.
No, I
And
absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. But what I was trying to get at, I may have articulated wrong, but the commitment is to the construction of a place or an idea that does not yet exist.
mhm,
It is promise. It is to come. It
yeah,
is not reality. It is
true.
not we have arrived at unified place. We in our whether it is in the Jewish suspicion of any place being the permanent place
Yeah,
because we're always passing through, whether it's there's something in that idea, there's something in all of our commitments that, as it's played out in the geography of our lives, it's something in our commitments and how we're moving these places together that I'm saying just refuses to commit to any of the existing realities. Yeah. I don't
yeah,
mean to suggest that we lack
mhm,
this ability to promise ourselves
yeah,
and apply ourselves and commit
yeah,
ourselves. But I think it's to the idea, and that's why I was just questioning this notion that Amichai brought up. Maybe I misunderstood that if we have arrived at something where now there's a dissolution of a here and there, and are we arriving at something which is more conjoined, or it doesn't feel yet like the promised place that I was imagining,
yeah,
nor would I ever commit to that place even if it arrived, because I'm always going to be more interested in the idea.
Politicians, which comes from the word polis, which is about place and center and city center and urban,
mhm, mhm.
human, political, economic realities of locale, this would be a different conversation. But we're not. We're Luftmenschen. We are people who are involved in the word and in
So,
creation and in creativity and in art. And if we are talking about books, which is I think the passions that we all have, which is why we're here, it takes me back to the book we have mentioned, which is, dare I say, the first and finest work of fiction on our bookshelf, which is the Torah. And I'll say that it's a work of fiction, whoever and whatever purpose it was written for and by, which has not only Abraham as the first Hebrew who's a nomad by definition, but the very so-called author of this text ends up on the edge of the promised land looking in and not getting there. And I think of the
mhm,
sentiment that has been so echoed by the
yeah,
story of this country, where Dr. King's famous last words, I have been to the top of the mountain, I have seen the promised land, I might not get there with you. How is that ethos part of this moment in America? Not just because of Black Lives Matter and finally a deep sense of racial reckoning and repair, but the ethos of America as the city on the hill, talking to the prophetic visions of the Judean vision and saying, can a society do the here and there? Can it transcend the the local, the limited local America first, Jews first, me above you, chosen, therefore you are not chosen. Can we create a new reality of the promised land? So I think the Torah from the get-go has built in its ethos of, as you both said, the aspirational, which means I'm here and I'm there. And that's the power of getting lost in a book. And at the same time, as Jews who are committed to our lives and our children's lives and our community lives, the question of Israel as the promised land, when an idea becomes a reality, that's just either a headache and or an invitation for a deep probe into a place that isn't either or, it's both and. And because we're not politicians, we don't have to talk that game of like Israel first and think, no, let's be in the place where we are continuing the relay race of the fact of fiction invitation into the in-between. You know, there's this Talmudic expression, kivyachol, as if, let's play a game. All these parables that the rabbis throw around, kivyachol, maybe there's a God and there's a throne and there's a thing. I don't know. It's a story. The Torah is a story. So here we are in the middle of Hanukkah, which is a story, probably a made-up story, that is sitting on the oldest human aspiration that in the middle of winter, when it's dark and cold and uncertain, you light candles. You fry up a lot of stuff in oil. You share gifts. You transcend the here and now of darkness with a mythic miracle of possibility. And whether that's Maccabees or the little oil that could or the longest night of the year, choose your own adventure. But something is long lasting here. And I suspect we're going to have to end pretty soon. So I'm going to take it back to this toy, to this dreidel, this vivon, that in some fantastic cultural humorous way is an object of play. I don't know if any of you have made or lost money on a dreidel. I never have. I think we paid for nothing. But it does simultaneously have the po v'sham, the here or there, but it keeps spinning. It just keeps spinning. Mm-hmm. And it maybe gives us an opportunity to think about who are we in 2020 and how can we invest this notion of both and in this imagined space, the third space, as a gift to the readers, to the spectators, to the participants in this conversation, and maybe relax, like drop your shoulders from like, it has to be Israel, has to be diaspora. You're right. No, chill, both and. Both and. Let's go into this third space of imagination, which is your gift as authors. And maybe that's the gift we can gift each other this Hanukkah, this gift of imagination in some way. I'm feeling very nourished by this conversation, getting ready for whatever comes ahead in this country and in Israel and everywhere. But I want to invite you both to maybe share a closing thought or question or a muse.
Oh, you ended so beautifully, Amichai.
Yeah, we wouldn't presume. We would not presume.
So, friend, I'm hoping this is one of many conversations since we are in New York, but we can meet in the third space too. And I really want to say this is so humbling to really think big and deep about some of the most pressing issues of our time, and to do it joyfully and with so much love and wisdom in the room. Chag Sameach. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.